Good morning, kitties. How are you? Afternoon, evening, depending on when you watch this. Miss Vader's here, obviously. Today we're going to be talking about evidence for evolution. So we've got a little slideshow. I'll run through it with you, and we'll look at the things that have told us that evolution is true. So our big overarching question is, how do we know evolution is real? Fantastic. So, evolution has been a theory for a long, long time. Darwin came up with this, as we know from our timelines. Darwin was not the only person to ever think about evolution. Lamarck, Wallace, and then all the people that contributed to Darwin's theory, like Malthus and Lyell and those geologists as well. And since then, there have been a lot of evolutionary biologists that have sort of pushed this theory. Lynn Margulis, Stephen Jay Gould, to name two of them. And despite the fact that it has been such a big theory and such a popular theory, it's also been very, very controversial, particularly in Western culture. And of course, one of the big conflicts has always been between religious scriptures, particularly Christian scriptures, and this idea of evolution. They conflict over the idea of how the world formed and how the world has changed over time. Despite that controversy, the world has accepted evolution in general. There are a few holdouts, but with the overwhelming evidence that we have today, it's kind of hard to say it doesn't actually happen. And there are lots of ways if you look at this, and I'll put something up about it later. I've got some material on different religious points of view, particularly the Islamic point of view for evolution, Hindu. They don't necessarily have a real conflict. And even the Catholic Church, the Pope has made a statement years ago that evolution is okay as a theory. So our main pieces of evidence, and I'll put those documents up later on today so you can take a look at them. The main evidence, there are four main things historically that people have used to prove the idea of evolution. The first is evidence we find in our fossil record. And then we start to look at this idea of similarities between organisms, what we know as homologous and analogous structures, and similarities between the development of embryos in different organisms. And then in our modern times, we've added to this DNA. All the DNA evidence is just irrefutable now that we can see it and know how it works, which is an advantage we have that they did not. Furthermore, there are two concepts or observations that we can make. The development of antibiotic-resistant bacteria that's happened over the last 10 to 15 years, and the process of selective breeding used to create new species. And of course, this idea of a species that changes, that's what evolution is, it changed through time. But species that reproduce very, very quickly, like bacteria, can evolve very, very quickly. And of course, that's one of our big concerns with coronavirus now is great. So we're working on finding a cure. We're working on finding a vaccine. But what if it mutates? And if you read the scientific research, some mutations have already happened, and we can track those. So it's not as alarming as it may seem. It's a normal process in nature. So fossil evidence is the first thing that people found. They dug these bones out of the earth. We know that fossils from Mr. Angelore's class with the earth science all happen in sedimentary rock, and so it is stratified or layered, and that gives us a timeline. We know that older layers are on the bottom, younger layers are on the top. So we can take these fossils and pull them out and order them and compare them to see how they have changed through time. This timeline of change provides evolution evidence. Hey, we can see that over a few thousand years, 10,000 years, million years, this particular organism looks like it has changed. the fossil record has been our primary evidence for assuming that things evolve from simple to complex as well, because very often when we look at these fossils, the things we see in lower layers, the older remains, are simpler. And over time, they get more complex. But that is an assumption. Doesn't always happen that way. We can go from complex to simple. But it just doesn't seem to be what's recorded in the fossil record. So be careful with making that assumption. Make sure you throw in the evidence and allow for exceptions. Don't make it as an absolute statement that we always go from simple to complex, because that may not be true. The fossil record is not without its limitations. Many species or groups can't actually become fossils. All of our invertebrates, worms, and insects, they don't have bones, and therefore they don't fossilize easily. Insects can be preserved in amber, which is tree sap that fossilizes. But beyond that, if they get buried in sediments, then they're just going to break down and decay. So the fossil record is not as complete. It's great for vertebrates, things that have bones. But for all the other things, it's really not very, very helpful. So it doesn't give us complete evidence, but it certainly was enough to get us started with this theory. Some species don't live in areas where sediments are being laid down, or they don't live in areas where there is accumulation of water, because most sedimentary rock forms in water, whether it's shallow lakes, ponds, oceans that are deeper. If you live in a mountainous region, you're very unlikely to be fossilized. And so the fossil record is incomplete for that reason. Tectonic movements, even once that sedimentary rock is laid down, uplift and shifting, metamorphic processes, subduction, all these things can destroy the fossil record once they are exposed. Weathering and erosion can destroy them. So once again, our fossil record is not complete. And the last major problem with the fossil record is that the organisms are not, we generally do not find whole organisms fossilized. We find parts. We'll find a leg bone or a skull or a forelimb or a rib cage or a spine. But we very, very rarely find the whole thing. And when we do find complete sets, it's generally multiple animals that died in the same location. And so we can piece together the fossils, but it's like taking skeletons from different animals and sort of putting them together. So it's good, but it's not perfect. Okay, on to our second piece of evidence, and that is homologous structures. So if you take a look at the diagram here, we see the forelimb, the front limb of different organisms: humans, horse, cat, bat, bird, and whale. And if you take a look, they're all very, very different. We know that the arm of a human and the front leg of a horse don't do the same thing. Humans stand on 2 feet. Horses stand on 4. You know that the arm of a human and the front leg of a cat, very, very different. If you compare the front leg of the cat to the front leg of the horse, very, very different. Look at all 3 of those, the human, the horse, and the cat, and compared to a bat, totally, totally different. A bird, also totally, totally different. Bats and birds both fly, and they both have wings, but the bone structure inside those wings is absolutely unique. And this is how we know that birds and bats are really not the same. Whales, similarly, they've got a front limb. It's a flipper, and its bone structure is completely different. But if you look closely, you can see that here up top, humans have one large, heavy bone. Okay. In humans, it's called the humerus. Below that, they have 2 thinner bones, the ulnus and the radia, or ulna and radius. I put the S on the end of the wrong thing. Excuse me. Ulnus and radius and ulna. But there's 2 bones. They're thinner. Then they've got this set of small round bones. That's what makes up our wrist. And then we have the digits, our fingers. And there's 5 of them. When you look at other organisms, the horse, the cat, the bat, the bird, and the whale, all of them have this large, heavy bone at the top, and it's singular, just one of them. Then we see two thinner individualized bones, here in the bird, here in the cat, here in the whale. In the bat, you see that those two bones fuse together. There's a little divot or indentation that shows on these bones inside bat wings, where you can see that it used to be two separate bones, but over time they fuse together. We see the same thing in horses. There's almost a back part and a front part to this bone, where the two bones have fused together. We see that set of round small bones here and here, humans and horse. We see the same thing on the cat. We see the same thing on the bird. They're teeny tiny. On the bat, we don't quite see them on the bird. There's a little piece here that we might consider, but we definitely do see them on the whale. And then we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and they miscolored it, 5 extensions, just like the 5 fingers on a human hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, and the horse's hoof is cloven. It's got 2 parts, so that's 5 that we see there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on a cat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on a bat. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 little pointy things on the bird. So yeah, these are all very, very different organisms, but their bone structures are very, very similar. Why? Why is it that all these vertebrate animals have similar structures? And the idea of homologous structures is that we have very different animals having bones or other structures that appear similar in form, but not in function. And so that 1, 2, lots 5 that we see shows up over and over and over again. Humans, we use our arms for lifting and holding and balancing. Horses use those front legs for standing and walking and running. Cats the same, standing and walking and running. Cats have those 5 appendages. They've got retractable claws. We don't have that. Bats have changed the structure entirely to now stretch those fingers out to create wings. But imagine what some of those intermediates would have looked like if we can. And this has led to all kinds of great monsters in science fiction and movies, where potentially the fingers with membrane stretched between them become those bat wings as the arms sort of shrink up. Despite outward differences, animals with homologous structures are somehow related, and that's our ultimate takeaway from this. And the job then of evolutionary biologists is to go back and look and say, hey, how is the bat related to the human? How is a cat related to a horse? How is a cat related to a human? And so we start off looking at those bone structures, and it's a good starting point. The other piece of biological evidence of similarity is embryologic evidence. So here we've got a picture of 8 different embryos at a very, very early stage of development. One of them is human. Can you tell which one? What about a fish? Chicken? Not easy. They all kind of look the same. And that's the point. Kind of like with the homologous structures, early embryos all look very, very, very similar. And so therefore we assume that they have some sort of similar ancestor. What about when they're a little bit later? Can you determine which is human now? What about the fish? Most people can find the fish now. We kind of have a 50-50 guess whether it's going to be this one or this one. What do you think? We'll find out at the end. But can you tell me which one is human? What about the chicken? Not as easy. Let's look at the later stage. So here we are. Now can we tell which is human? Most people can usually guess it at this point. What about the fish? Fish is easy. We see the fish now. This one that might have been the fish in the last was is a salamander or a newt. Here we see our chicken. We start to see the formation of a beak and those wings. But notice that this is starting to take on that form of a wing like we saw in the homologous structures, whereas the turtle is getting its little leg and the pig is getting its little hoof. Okay. So here we see everything. We've got a fish, a salamander, a turtle or tortoise. Here's our chicken, pig, calf or cow, rabbit, and they do not look that unsimilar. And the only real difference between the rabbit, calf, and pig at this point is that snout that we see. And then last is the human. Once again, not a lot of differences at this stage between the human, the rabbit, the calf, and the pig. We're starting to see differences in appendages, but it's not super apparent because we still see that triple bend with the ankle, the knee, and the hip that you see on some of these other organisms that are known as digitigrade. The fact that all these organisms go through similar stages of development before they are born gives us evidence of evolutionary similarities. They all started to develop in a similar way. We assume they all have similar ancestors and that they have these traits. There's an old saying that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, meaning exactly what we're looking at here. This idea that the organisms developing, that's ontogeny, recapitulates or reflects or shows the phylogeny or the evolutionary relationships in those things. So it's this idea that the development of an organism sort of reflects the evolutionary history that the organism has gone through, that it's going to go through similar stages. It's kind of a wacky theory. It's really not commonly accepted anymore, but it certainly was for quite some time. Last, we'll speed up to modern times and look at similarities in DNA. We just did a whole unit on genetics, talking about DNA structure and its function, the replication, transcription, and translation, how we create those proteins. And definitely, DNA sequences that are similar are going to create proteins that are similar. And we remember that from our genetics unit. Those similar proteins can create similar structures and similar functions within organisms. If we look at a comparison of how much your DNA compares with other organisms, you're 99.9% similar to other human beings. That's 0.1% that makes you, you, and me, me. So we're really, really similar. We want to think we're super unique, but those uniquenesses are very, very small on the genetic scale. If we look at our closest cousins, chimpanzees, we're 96 to 98% similar. Okay, dogs, 84% similar. Fruit flies, 47% similar. And unsurprisingly, grapes or plants were much less similar. It's 24%. We are still living things. We do still have some DNA and some proteins in common with plants, which means somewhere in our history, we have to have some sort of a common ancestor. The other thing that we've discovered is now that we understand how DNA functions, we know that DNA is a molecule that passes information from parents to children. We can conclude that DNA is a way that species maintain similarities within them. And we start to see this idea in our modern understanding. There's a whole set of genes called Hox genes, which control the layout of all organisms. And this was a major discovery that happened in the mid to late 1980s. It just revolutionized what we know about human development, but also just genetics in general. It confirmed a lot of these big theories. And you can see here that there are these genes, the Hox genes. They come in various locations. And different organisms have different combinations of them. But these are the things that create a head and a thorax and an abdomen. And we start to see this alignment of similar locations and similar alignments within bodies. The same genes control the development of that lower part of the body. The same genes control that portion of the upper part of the body. Okay. And not a big surprise. I mean, here we see the red. Here we see the red. Those are our head, face, mouth parts. We see our antennae, which are done in purple. And those are those sensory areas of the lower brain. And we have that other area of the brain in the head that comes in here. That would be more the brain stem for humans. That thoracic area, that chest area, the same, whether it's flies, humans, dogs, cats, octopus, doesn't matter. We all share those same basic genes for body format. And it answers a lot of the big questions, like, why do we always assume that there's a mouth on the head? Why do we always assume symmetry? The right side and the left side are the same. There's always going to be a top and a bottom, and we define that by where the head is. Why? Why is it that way? Now we know that there are genes that control all of that stuff for us. So that kind of wraps up the four main pieces of evidence. So fossil record is the first one, and probably the oldest that we've been using to talk about evolution. Homologous structures and embryological similarities. Also, the homologous structures is definitely older than the embryologic evidence. And then our last is the DNA evidence and similarities between protein structures, similarity between genes in organisms. And so we can see that. But the last thing I want to talk about is the two other sort of more modern observations. One thing about science is it's known to be empirical, meaning we don't believe it unless we see it. And if you see it, you have to believe it. So there are several things that we have done in human history. There are several things that we have observed in human history, even in recent history, that show this idea of an organism changing over time. And that's our definition of evolution. It's this idea that a group or a species changes slowly over time. Bacteria have become, not all, but some bacteria have become resistant to antibiotics. One of the famous is MRSA, MRSA. It's methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Good trivia, nice to know. If you're going into medicine, you definitely want to know it. But otherwise, it's good to recognize. We see the same thing, and this should look familiar. This should remind you of the beaks, not beaks of finches. We haven't done that yet. The pepper moth simulation that you did Friday and over the weekend. We have a group of organisms, in this case, bacteria. There are normal bacteria. They're this orange color. There's 6 of them. And then there are resistant bacteria. That's that singular blue one. Important thing, there is variation in the population to start off with. The bacteria resistant, or the antibiotic resistance, didn't happen magically. It was always there. It was just not the majority of the population. And so let's just assume this is something that causes a sore throat, like streptococcus, giving us strep throat. We take an antibiotic. It kills the bacteria that causes our infection and makes us feel better. It may also kill good bacteria, though. It can't usually discern good from bad. It just kills all bacteria. But there's one little cell that is resistant, and it doesn't get killed. So what's going to happen to that one cell? It's going to reproduce. And because it has a gene that makes it resistant, it's going to pass that gene off to its offspring. And now we have a population filled with bacteria that are resistant to the antibiotics we're going to use. Okay? that's going to pass off to other bacteria. We have seen this happen in our lifetimes. It's been in the last 10 to maybe 15 years. It's been a big, big problem. It's one of our fears now with the coronavirus. What mutations are going to make this virus better or worse for us? We don't know. We can't predict. But it is something that we've witnessed. And if we've witnessed this change in a species happen, we can't say that it doesn't. That's the nature of science. Because we've watched this happen, we know that species change over time. That's what evolution is. Okay. Furthermore, we've had a hand in it. We talked about selective breeding when we talked about biotechnology, and we've been doing that for 10,000 years. We started with gray wolves, and using that, we have bred all the different types of dogs by choosing what traits we want those dogs to have and reproducing those dogs. Okay. In selective breeding, humans control the evolution by determining which traits are going to be selected for. In the peppered moth, moths were selected based on their coloration, whether they were dark colored or light colored, and the type of forest they were living in and the amount of pollution that colored that forest. And essentially it was camouflage. If they were camouflaged, the birds can't eat them as easily. Not that they never get eaten, but it's harder. Well, in this case, humans made the decision. We want a dog with long ears. We want a dog with a slender body. We want a dog with a lot of fur. We want a dog that has really good sight or really good smell. Usually there's definitely a purpose for that. Okay? Whether it's guarding or hunting or just companionship. We made those things. And so that is artificial selection, not natural selection. But once again, it does demonstrate that over time, a species can change. And we can get similar traits collected within small groups. That's our definition of evolution. We've done it with dogs, and we've done it with cats. We've done it with all of our livestock, cows and horses and sheep and pigs and goats. We've done it with all of our food. Okay. So we're not without any of this stuff happening. All right. So to wrap up, I'd like you to write about it. Which piece of evidence do you think is most convincing to you that evolution is a reality and that evolution actually works? When you talk about this with other people, what is it that you can say is, hey, this is what I believe and this is why? So give me that paragraph. Important things to do, make sure you connect back to this slideshow, and I will attach that to the assignment so that you can view it at your leisure without me talking over it. Annoying? I don't know. Helpful? Maybe. You tell me. And you can sort of go slowly through that stuff, relook at things again if you want. You're welcome to play the video again. Okay. And get that into me sometime today. And then tomorrow we'll go back to the textbook. If you do have questions, I will be doing a Google Hangout this afternoon. So pay attention for that. I'll post details. All right. Have a great day. Stay healthy. Bye-bye.